a cold courtroom, and an unlikely encounter. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, leaving a chill in the air, despite the flickering warmth of the overhead fluorescent lights. The walls, adorned with dull shades of gray, offered no comfort, only the harsh realities of a place where decisions could change the course of one's life in an instant. A room that promised justice, but often delivered more of the same. The judge's bench gleamed under the lights, its polished wood reflecting the solemnity of the space. Melanie Carter, a black woman in her mid-30s, sat at the defendant's chair, her heart racing not because she feared the outcome of her case, but because she already knew the judgment she would face. She had been in situations like this before. The subtle dismissive looks, the way people assumed her worth based on her skin, and the unspoken biases that often dictated the outcome before the first word was spoken. Today was no different, but today she was prepared. Her suit, a sharp, tailored outfit that exuded professionalism, did nothing to change the way Judge Clarence Willis would see her. As he walked into the room, his gray brows furrowed in disapproval at the sight of her. It was the look of someone who already had a preconceived notion of who she was, what she represented, and how little her presence mattered in this space. He didn't know her name, didn't know her background, but he assumed her story based solely on her skin color. He muttered under his breath, loud enough for the bailiff and court clerk to hear, "Another one." The words were thick with disdain. His gaze never wavered from her, and the court clerk exchanged an uneasy glance with the bailiff, both of them unsure of what to do. The air was thick with tension, and the unease was palpable. Melanie knew this moment well. She had been underestimated her entire life, a woman who had been told time and again that her presence was unimportant. But today, she was not going to back down. The case before her seemed simple enough, a minor traffic violation, a stop for rolling through a stop sign. But for Melanie, it was more than that. It was a reminder of how, sometimes, the smallest of actions could be used as a weapon against you. The officer who had pulled her over had been trailing her for miles before activating his lights. He had no reason to stop her, but that didn't matter. He had his reasons, and they were based on who she was. Judge Willis barely looked at the file in front of him. He'd waved his hand dismissively, clearly uninterested in the details of the case. "You know the drill, pay the fine, $500, and let's not waste the court's time," he said, his voice dripping with indifference. Melanie sat up straighter in her seat. The words stung, but she was resolute. She knew what was happening here. It wasn't just about a traffic violation. It was about being dismissed before she had even spoken. It was about being reduced to nothing more than the color of her skin. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I would like to present my case. I believe this ticket was issued unfairly, and I have evidence to prove it." Judge Willis didn't even look up. He was leaning back in his chair, clearly uninterested in hearing what she had to say. "Evidence from you? Fine. Let's hear it," he muttered, waving a hand dismissively, as though her words were beneath him. Taking a deep breath, Melanie stood and pulled out her phone. She played the video she had recorded during the traffic stop, the footage of the officer tailing her car for several blocks before pulling her over. The officer's voice was unmistakable in the recording as he said, "You people think you can do whatever you want." A hush fell over the courtroom. The room, once filled with the usual noise of paperwork shuffling and the occasional cough, now sat in stunned silence. The judge's face had grown pale, his expression a mixture of discomfort and denial. Judge Willis, clearly unwilling to acknowledge the truth that was staring him in the face, cleared his throat. "That's irrelevant. You still broke the law," he said, his words sharp and cutting. Melanie's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained calm. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I didn't break the law, and I find it troubling that you won't even consider the evidence before you." Her words hung in the air. They weren't just a challenge to the judge's ruling. They were a challenge to the entire system that had allowed people like her to be treated as invisible, as less than. The judge's face turned crimson. His fists clenched as he slammed his gavel down. "Watch your tone, young lady. This is my courtroom, and I won't be lectured by someone like you." "Someone like me," Melanie repeated, her voice steady but laced with the weight of years of injustice. "Let me introduce myself properly. My name is Melanie Carter, and I am a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice. I specialize in cases involving police misconduct." The room froze. The gasps from the spectators were audible as they absorbed the weight of her words. The court clerk, unable to hide her shock, dropped her pen. The judge, who had assumed he was in complete control, suddenly found himself at a loss for words. He stammered, "You're what?" "I am a federal prosecutor," Melanie repeated, "and I've already reported the officer who issued this ticket to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. I will be filing a formal complaint about his conduct and the discriminatory practices that led to this citation. As for this courtroom, I'll be requesting a review of your record to ensure impartiality moving forward." Melanie's words were not just a declaration of her position. They were a promise that she would not allow the system to continue to operate with such blatant bias. Unmasking the system. The room felt like a pressure cooker now. Melanie stood with unwavering composure, her eyes never leaving Judge Willis, as she presented the evidence that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed facade of impartiality. The video on her phone had revealed the officer's prejudice, his hostility, and his clear targeting of her. But the reality of the situation went far beyond one officer's actions. It was the reflection of a deep-seated issue, a system where people like her were treated as less than, where skin color determined fate before a word was spoken. But she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been judged solely on their appearance. The tension in the room was palpable. The usual hum of the courtroom had stopped. All eyes were on Melanie, as if waiting for her next move. For Judge Willis, the silence was a blow to his ego. He had assumed control the moment he entered the room, believing he could dismiss her like every other defendant who had dared to challenge him. But now, he was struggling to regain that control, the veneer of authority slipping away with every word that left Melanie's mouth. "Your Honor, I believe you owe me an explanation," she said, her voice steady. "You've dismissed my case without even considering the evidence I've presented. And yet you've made your assumptions based on my skin color, not on my actions." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Melanie could see the struggle on his face. He was caught between his prejudices and the reality that she had just shown him irrefutable evidence of misconduct. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, certainly not by someone who looked like her. "You still broke the law," he repeated, his words growing more defensive, a last-ditch attempt to assert control. "That officer had every right to stop you." "I'm not here to argue whether I broke the law," Melanie responded, her voice cool, her composure unwavering. "I'm here because that officer targeted me for no reason other than the color of my skin. He followed me for miles before pulling me over." His first words were not about the alleged stop sign violation. They were about my race. "So yes, the law might have been broken, but not in the way you're suggesting." The judge's face turned red with anger, but Melanie could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had hoped that she would just back down, that she would accept her fate and pay the fine. But she wasn't just anyone. Melanie had spent years in the courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a prosecutor. She knew how this system worked, and she wasn't going to let it continue to operate with the same flaws that allowed people like her to be targeted. "You're out of line, young lady," Judge Willis spat, his tone laced with condescension. "I will not tolerate being lectured by someone like you." "Someone like me?" Melanie repeated, her voice low but resolute. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the injustice of it all threatening to boil over. "What do you mean by that, Your Honor?" "Someone like me who has spent her career fighting for justice, fighting against the very biases you're so comfortable displaying." The courtroom fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably at the door, and the court clerk sat frozen, her eyes wide in disbelief. Melanie had done what no one else had dared to do. She had confronted the very system that had oppressed her for so long, and now she was making it clear that she wouldn't tolerate it any longer. Judge Willis opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The power he had so confidently wielded moments ago now seemed to escape him. Melanie's calm authority had shattered his false sense of superiority, and it was clear that he was struggling to regain control. "I'd like to introduce myself properly, Your Honor," Melanie continued, her voice still calm, but now filled with undeniable authority. "My name is Melanie Carter, and I am a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice. I specialize in cases involving police misconduct." There was a collective gasp in the room. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. The weight of her words hung in the air, as if the entire world had paused to take in what had just been revealed. The judge's face, which had been flushed with anger, now turned pale, his mouth hanging slightly open as he processed the revelation. "You're a federal prosecutor?" Judge Willis stammered, clearly taken aback. He had assumed she was just another person caught in the gears of a biased system. But now he was faced with the reality that he had underestimated the very person who had walked into his courtroom. "I am," Melanie affirmed, her voice unwavering. "And I'm also someone who believes in fairness, in truth, and in accountability. What you've done here today is not just an insult to me. It's an insult to every person who has ever walked into your courtroom, hoping to receive justice. And now that I'm here, I'm going to make sure you're held accountable for it." Judge Willis sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. He had assumed that, like so many others, Melanie would accept her fate without question. But she wasn't just another defendant, and this was not just another case. Melanie wasn't just here to challenge a ticket. She was here to challenge the system itself. "I've already reported the officer who issued this ticket to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division," she continued, "and I'll be filing a formal complaint against him for his discriminatory actions. As for this courtroom and the way you've handled this case, I'll be requesting a full review of your record to ensure that no one else is subjected to the same treatment I've endured here today." Melanie's words were sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. The truth was out now, and there was no hiding from it. The officer who had unjustly targeted her was under investigation, and the judge who had treated her with such disdain was about to face the consequences of his actions. The room seemed to breathe again, the oppressive silence breaking as people shifted in their seats. The court clerk, who had dropped her pen earlier, was now frantically scribbling notes, the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just a small courtroom skirmish. This was a confrontation that had the potential to send ripples through the very fabric of the justice system. Melanie stood tall, her gaze unwavering, as the judge struggled to recover from the shock of being confronted by someone who was not only fully aware of his biases, but also armed with the power to do something about them. She wasn't here for apologies or excuses. She was here to ensure that the system didn't get to continue operating under the assumption that people like her could be ignored, dismissed, or oppressed without consequence. The room was still, but now there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Melanie had set the stage for what was to come, and it was clear that she wasn't going to stop until the system had been forced to reckon with the biases it so often allowed to fester unchecked. In that moment, the battle wasn't just between one woman and one judge. It was between the system, as it had always been, and the change that was long overdue. Melanie Carter had just turned the tables. The fallout. The news of what had transpired in Judge Willis's courtroom spread like wildfire. It was more than just a confrontation between a defiant defendant and an arrogant judge. It was a story that touched a raw nerve in society, a story that made people confront the uncomfortable reality of systemic injustice and racial bias. The headlines blared, "Federal Prosecutor Confronts Biased Judge and Racist Police Officer." But beyond the headlines, the reverberations of Melanie's actions would go far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The morning after the incident, the story was all anyone could talk about. News outlets, both local and national, reported the shocking exchange. Social media was flooded with posts of support for Melanie and outrage at the treatment she had faced. Her bravery was being lauded by activists, civil rights groups, and even some within the legal community who had long known about the biases that plagued the system, but had never been in a position to call it out so directly. Melanie's decision to stand up to Judge Wallace was a rare moment of courage in a world where people often cower in the face of authority. It was a wake-up call that the system was broken, that it wasn't just about one biased judge or one police officer. It was about the way these biases were allowed to seep into every aspect of the legal process. It wasn't just the black men and women on the receiving end of racial profiling, but the very system that was supposed to serve them, justice itself, that was being corrupted. Within days, the officer who had issued Melanie the traffic ticket was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. The video she had presented during her hearing had exposed more than just his words. It revealed a pattern of behavior that had gone unnoticed, or worse, ignored, for far too long. Melanie had set in motion a process that would now force the police department to address these abuses. The officer's record was scrutinized, and it became clear that he had a history of targeting minority drivers, pulling them over for the smallest of infractions or, more often, for no reason at all. His actions had reflected an underlying bias, a prejudice that had become so ingrained in the way he carried out his duties that he likely never considered it a problem. As the investigation unfolded, it wasn't just the officer who was held accountable. The department itself found itself under the microscope. An audit was initiated, and soon, other cases came to light that showed a troubling pattern of discrimination in policing. The department, which had long claimed to uphold the ideals of fairness and equality, was now being forced to confront its own flaws. The scrutiny was intense, and the pressure to take swift action was enormous. Many officers were reassigned, and some were placed on leave while their actions were reviewed. The fallout from Melanie's confrontation was only just beginning. In the days that followed, Melanie received an outpouring of support from her colleagues within the Department of Justice. As a federal prosecutor, she had often seen the darker side of law enforcement, the systemic issues that festered beneath the surface. But this was different. The bravery she had shown in calling out the judge and the officer wasn't just an isolated act of defiance. It was a call to action for everyone who had witnessed or been a part of the legal system to step up and hold those in power accountable. But the support from her colleagues was tempered by something darker. Behind closed doors, Melanie knew there were whispers. Some in the department were uneasy about the attention she had brought to herself. It wasn't just that she had exposed a racist officer and a biased judge. She had brought an uncomfortable truth into the light. For many, that truth was more dangerous than the systemic racism that had been allowed to persist. The idea that change could actually happen, that the system could be reformed, was something that some of her peers feared. It meant rocking the very foundations of their careers and the way they had been operating. But for Melanie, there was no going back. The truth had been spoken, and there was no place left to hide. Meanwhile, Judge Wallace found himself at the center of a growing controversy. Once seen as a pillar of the local legal community, he was now a symbol of everything that was wrong with the justice system. His history of biased rulings against black defendants began to emerge, one case after another. It turned out that Melanie wasn't the first person to be unfairly treated in his courtroom. Far from it. His record was a series of questionable rulings, each one more troubling than the last. The Judicial Review Board, which had been hesitant at first to act, now had no choice but to investigate. They combed through Judge Wallace's rulings, conducting interviews with attorneys and defendants who had appeared before him. The patterns were clear. A tendency to rule against black defendants more often than not, a preference for harsher sentences, and a dismissive attitude toward the evidence presented by defense lawyers. It didn't take long for the review board to conclude that Wallace had abused his position, allowing his biases to influence his judgments. He was forced to step down from the bench, and his name became synonymous with the kind of prejudice that had no place in the legal system. The scandal rocked the judicial community. For years, Judge Willis had been seen as a respected figure, someone who was above reproach. But now, his fall from grace was a reminder that even those in positions of great power could be brought down when their actions were exposed. The repercussions were far-reaching. Several other cases that had been overseen by Judge Willis were brought into question. The legal community began to review old cases, some dating back decades, to ensure that no one had been unfairly punished or discriminated against. The floodgates had opened, and it was clear that Melanie's actions had set a new precedent. But the fallout was not limited to the legal profession alone. Across the country, the public's attention was now focused on the issues of racial profiling, police misconduct, and judicial bias. Activists and civil rights leaders rallied behind Melanie's cause, using her story as a rallying cry for reform. Protests erupted in cities, demanding that law enforcement and the justice system be held accountable for their actions. Politicians who had once been silent on these issues now found themselves under pressure to take action. Laws were proposed to increase transparency in policing, to require body cameras on officers, and to mandate diversity training for judges and law enforcement officers. The conversation around racial justice reached new heights, and it was clear that Melanie's actions had sparked something much larger than herself. But with all this attention came a new set of challenges for Melanie. The spotlight, while empowering, also brought with it new scrutiny. She knew that she would face backlash, and she wasn't wrong. Behind the closed doors of the Department of Justice, there were those who saw her as a troublemaker, someone who had stirred up a hornet's nest. Her actions, no matter how justified, had disrupted the delicate balance of power that many had worked so hard to maintain. Some feared that her continued involvement in the case would further expose the flaws within the system, making it more difficult to maintain the status quo. Despite the pressure, Melanie remained resolute. She knew that the fight for justice wasn't about comfort. It was about doing what was right. She had already made it clear that she wasn't afraid to stand alone if necessary, and she wasn't about to back down now. As the investigations into the officer and the judge continued, Melanie knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in her life, she felt hopeful that real change was possible. The consequences of her actions had rippled outward, from the officer's suspension to the judge's removal, from the national conversation on racial bias to the scrutiny of the entire judicial system. And though the journey was far from over, one thing was clear. Melanie had set in motion a force that could no longer be stopped. The ripple effect. The events that unfolded in Judge Willis's courtroom and the subsequent fallout went far beyond the walls of the courtroom itself. Melanie Carter's decision to speak out had not only shifted the trajectory of her own career and life, but had ignited a spark in others that would change the way people viewed justice, accountability, and their place in the world. The ripples of that day, from the moment she stood up and introduced herself to the judge, stretched far and wide, touching lives across the nation, from ordinary citizens to lawmakers, from activists to public servants. Her bravery had made a statement louder than words. It had made a lasting impact. Days after the story broke, Melanie received thousands of messages, some from strangers who expressed gratitude for her courage, and others from those who shared their own painful experiences of injustice. Social media became flooded with stories of people, particularly Black men and women, who had suffered similar treatment at the hands of law enforcement, biased judges, and a system that too often ignored their humanity. Many of these stories had never been told, buried under years of fear, silence, and apathy. But now, the floodgates had opened, and they were demanding to be heard. It wasn't just the people who had experienced injustice firsthand who were moved by Melanie's actions. Her story reached those who had never been affected by racial profiling or police misconduct, opening their eyes to the systematic issues embedded in institutions they had long trusted. Conversations that had once been limited to certain circles now spread to living rooms, dinner tables, and online forums across the country. People began asking difficult questions. How had things gotten this way? How many times had they, too, turned a blind eye to what was happening around them? Were they complicit by staying silent? And most importantly, what could they do to help change the system? In cities and towns across the country, people began organizing, rallying, and pushing for reform. Civil rights organizations, who had long been advocating for change, found themselves with a renewed sense of purpose and momentum. Melanie had lit the fire, and it was spreading. For some, the ripple effect was immediate. Lawmakers, who had once been slow to act on issues of police reform and judicial accountability, began to face increased pressure from their constituents. It was no longer enough to simply express concern about racial disparities in the justice system. The time for talking was over. The people demanded action. A new wave of legislation emerged, aimed at curbing police misconduct and addressing judicial bias. Senators and congresspeople, particularly those in states with significant minority populations, found themselves under scrutiny, being forced to take a public stand on the issues that had once been relegated to the fringes of political discourse. One of the first and most significant moves came in the form of proposed national legislation designed to mandate more transparency within law enforcement agencies. New bills called for the mandatory use of body cameras by police officers and a nationwide registry of complaints against law enforcement officers, making it easier for citizens to report misconduct. The idea was that greater accountability, particularly through the use of technology, would help curb abuses of power. For years, such bills had languished in Congress, dismissed by powerful lobbyists and political figures who feared the ramifications of actually holding police officers accountable. But now, after Melanie's courageous stand, those same politicians found themselves publicly endorsing bills they had once opposed, knowing that their own constituents were demanding change. In the same vein, the judicial system was not left untouched. As public outcry over the behavior of Judge Wallace grew louder, the State Judicial Review Board launched an unprecedented investigation into other judges who had a similar history of biased rulings. For too long, judges had been able to operate with near total immunity, protected by an outdated system of legal precedent and the unwritten rule that those in power should not be questioned. But Melanie had exposed the cracks in that system, showing that accountability was not just a matter of applying the law. It was about applying the law impartially and without bias. Judge Wallace's ousting had sent shockwaves through the judiciary. His removal was symbolic, a victory for those who had long fought to address racial bias in the court system. But it was also just the beginning. Across the country, several high-profile cases began to gain attention, where judges had been accused of unfairly ruling against black defendants. Legal experts and activists started calling for greater oversight of judges' records, particularly with regard to racial discrimination. It became increasingly clear that for meaningful change to take place, the courts needed to be reformed as much as law enforcement needed to be reformed. For Melanie, the growing movement surrounding the issue brought with it both pride and pressure. She had known that standing up would come with its challenges, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of national attention. It was one thing to challenge an unjust system in the confines of her professional life, but now her actions were being scrutinized by the entire nation. As the stories of systemic injustice continued to pour in from around the country, Melanie felt both a sense of validation and a burden. She was now seen as a leader, a symbol of hope for those who had been overlooked for far too long. She had made a name for herself, but it was no longer about the recognition. It was about what came next. To her surprise, she found herself invited to speak at rallies, town halls, and even before lawmakers themselves. People who had once been silent now turned to her for guidance. "What do we do now?" they asked. "How can we help?" Melanie had never considered herself an activist. But she understood that this moment was bigger than her. It wasn't about personal accolades. It was about the movement that had been born from the courage to confront injustice. She realized that her platform could be used to push for real change. So, with a renewed sense of purpose, she began collaborating with civil rights organizations to help shape the future of the reform efforts that were now underway. She also started pushing for more support for those who had been impacted by police brutality. The families, the communities, the individuals who had lost so much to the hands of those meant to protect them, they needed to be heard. She worked to ensure that those voices were not drowned out in the chaos of political discourse. Through her connections and her influence, she began to advocate for the creation of victim support programs, aimed at helping those affected by police misconduct to navigate the complexities of the legal system. It was during one of these rallies that Melanie's impact became undeniable. A crowd of thousands had gathered, and the energy was electric. She took the stage, and as the microphone crackled to life, the crowd fell silent, hanging on to her every word. Melanie spoke of the importance of standing up for what was right, of the courage it took to confront the systems that sought to oppress, and the hope that came with knowing that things could be different if people were willing to fight for it. Change doesn't come easily, she said, but it starts with one person deciding that they will no longer accept things as they are. It starts with a willingness to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And it starts with each of us doing our part to ensure that we don't just talk about justice. We make it a reality for everyone. The crowd erupted in applause, but Melanie knew the work wasn't done. She had lit the spark, but now the real work of dismantling the systems of power and privilege had just begun. And it would take the collective will of thousands, maybe millions, to make it happen. Across the country, the ripple effect continued to build. The movement was no longer just about one woman's stand against a biased judge. It had become a movement for justice, for accountability, and for change. And at the center of it all stood Melanie Carter, unshaken, unrelenting, and determined to see it through to the end. She had given the world a glimpse of what was possible when one person, fueled by conviction and courage, stood up against injustice. And that was a force more powerful than anyone had anticipated. A call to action. The days following Melanie Carter's public confrontation with Judge Willis and the subsequent fallout were nothing short of transformative. As the shockwaves of her actions reverberated through the media, through legal circles, and into the very heart of communities across the nation, it became evident that the consequences of her courage extended far beyond one courtroom drama. Her decision to stand up not just for herself, but for all those who had been wronged by a biased system, had ignited a movement, one that demanded change on a scale that had not been seen in years. The national conversation had shifted. The issues of police brutality, racial profiling, and systemic injustice, topics that had long been relegated to the periphery of mainstream dialogue, were suddenly at the forefront of political debate. Leaders, lawmakers, and institutions that had once refused to address these issues were now compelled to do so. The conversation was no longer about isolated incidents. It was about a fundamental flaw in the way the justice system operated, a flaw that had been allowed to persist for far too long. At the heart of it all was Melanie. She had become the face of the movement, though she had never sought such a role. It was simply the result of her actions, her refusal to back down, her demand for accountability, and her steadfast belief that justice meant more than a simple legal procedure. It meant fairness, equality, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But the question that loomed over everything was, what now? The spark had been lit, but how could it be kept burning? How could this newfound momentum be turned into meaningful, lasting change? It was one thing to call out the flaws in the system. It was another to ensure that those flaws were corrected. And that was where Melanie's leadership became even more crucial. She had already proven herself to be fearless, but now it was time for her to channel that fearlessness into action. She began meeting with other leaders in the legal community, civil rights activists, and lawmakers to strategize on the next steps. The ideas came fast and furious. Reforming the police academy's training curriculum to include anti-bias education, implementing independent oversight of police departments, ensuring greater transparency in judicial proceedings, and mandating more thorough vetting of judges for their histories of biased rulings. But the most important idea, the one that emerged from all the meetings and discussions, was the need for a broad-based coalition, a movement that could keep pushing for reform, not just in the courts, but across all institutions that perpetuated inequality. With the country's attention now focused on racial justice, the timing was right for a new wave of advocacy. Melanie knew that one person, even one as visible as she had become, couldn't carry the load alone. The movement had to be larger, more diverse, and more decentralized. It needed the collective strength of those who had been fighting for change long before she had ever stepped into that courtroom. And most importantly, it needed to be sustained, because true justice was not a fleeting moment of victory. It was a continuous process of pushing, organizing, and demanding accountability until the system itself was fundamentally altered. Melanie, ever the strategist, began using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had been part of the fight long before her. She reached out to community organizers, grassroots groups, and local activists who had been on the ground for years, working to bring about change in their own neighborhoods. She understood that the path to meaningful change wasn't just about high-profile cases or media attention. It was about creating an infrastructure of support that could withstand the inevitable pushback from those who were invested in maintaining the status quo. She spent weeks traveling across the country, speaking with families affected by police brutality, sitting down with activists who had been organizing for decades, and working alongside legal experts who had spent their careers studying the systemic issues that Melanie herself had exposed. Each conversation, each encounter, only strengthened her resolve. What was clear to her was that the change she sought wasn't just about changing a few laws or holding a few individuals accountable. It was about changing an entire system that had been designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Back in Washington, the pressure was mounting. Senators and congresspeople who had once turned a blind eye to issues of police misconduct and judicial bias now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to choose a side. Public opinion had shifted dramatically in the wake of Melanie's actions. The people, the voters, were no longer willing to accept excuses. The calls for reform were loud, persistent, and impossible to ignore. And yet, as the conversation grew louder, Melanie began to see the cracks in the movement. As the momentum shifted, so too did the arguments. The political machine, which had long been resistant to change, began to fight back. Powerful lobbyists from police unions, as well as conservative pundits, began to frame the debate as one of law and order versus chaos. They argued that reforms would make it harder for police officers to do their jobs, and that holding judges and law enforcement accountable would lead to an erosion of trust in the justice system. The pushback was swift, and it was fierce. But Melanie wasn't deterred. She knew that the fight for justice was never going to be easy. Change, real change, would always come with resistance. That was why the movement needed to be unified. It needed to be resilient, and most importantly, it needed to be strategic. She had learned that there was no such thing as a single moment that could change everything. It wasn't just about the video, the courtroom confrontation, or the press coverage. Those were important, critical even. But they were just the beginning. The real work would be in the long haul. Melanie began pushing for an all-encompassing approach to justice reform, one that didn't just focus on policing, but also on education, healthcare, economic opportunity, and housing. The criminal justice system was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and if the system was to be truly reformed, it couldn't be done piecemeal. It had to be a complete overhaul of the systems that perpetuated inequality in every facet of life. She became one of the leading voices in a national effort to pass comprehensive criminal justice reform legislation. She worked alongside other prosecutors, civil rights lawyers, and activists to draft a new set of bills that would implement far-reaching changes, from improved police training and better methods of accountability to the reduction of cash bail and the decriminalization of certain low-level offenses. The legislation also called for a massive overhaul of sentencing laws, which disproportionately affected communities of color, ensuring that people weren't incarcerated for non-violent crimes at rates that were out of proportion to the offenses committed. But this time, Melanie made sure the voices of those most affected were at the center of the process. She held town halls, where community members could speak directly with lawmakers, and made sure that their concerns were not just heard, but taken seriously. She traveled to places where the criminal justice system had wreaked the most havoc, from the streets of Chicago to the rural towns of the South, ensuring that those who had been fighting for change for years were given the platform they deserved. The political landscape began to shift. Senators and congresspeople, sensing that the public demand for change was not going away, began to sign on to reform bills. The movement had moved from the margins of political discourse to the center, and now it was forcing politicians to choose whether to stand on the side of justice or against it. Melanie's voice was loud, but she knew the movement needed more. It needed the voices of young people, of families who had lost loved ones, of teachers, students, and ordinary citizens who had watched the system fail time and time again. Every voice counted, and every action mattered. She was not just one person anymore. She was a representative of a collective will, a movement that would no longer accept the status quo. And with that realization came a profound sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. The choice was clear: stand by and let things remain as they were, or push forward and demand a justice system that served everyone equally. Melanie had made her choice, and now the movement had to make its own. It was a call to action, not just for those who had always fought for justice, but for everyone who believed in fairness, equality, and the power of collective action. Change was coming, and Melanie was ready to lead the charge.